today we're joined by Jasmine Sussex. Jasmine, would you like to introduce yourself?
Okay, so my name is Jasmine and I'm a mother of three, and I came to this crazy world as a volunteer breastfeeding counsellor with the Australian Breastfeeding Association. And unfortunately, way back in early 2020, I went to a breastfeeding conference and we were having pre-conference drinks in our region, the local area where I live, with the other breastfeeding counsellors. And this young breastfeeding counsellor, who I knew had a sort of preschool age child, she wasn't a good friend of mine, but started talking about taking her daughter that day to the gender clinic and talking to the gender clinic about socially transitioning her child.
Sorry, how old was that child?
4,
4.
just
My
4.
goodness.
Yeah, little baby girl.
Oh,
Who, I mean, in the Breastfeeding Association, I might shock you or your viewers a little bit, Kelly, but it's pretty normal for breastfeeding counsellors to do what we call, natural weaning, or, like child-led weaning. So it'd be quite common for the child of a breastfeeding counsellor to be, walking, talking, and in preschool when they self-wean from the breast. And
right.
this mother was similar. Her child had weaned a bit over 2, and literally almost as soon as the child was weaned, there was talk about the child being a boy. And then when the child was 4, after what I was told was, some kind of hand wringing and, head holding
Head
by the
scratching.
mother, allegedly. I mean, probably she'd taken her 4-year-old to the gender clinic in Melbourne, which is quite a famous gender clinic in Australia. It likes to call itself the, world's best, globally bestest gender clinic, and it's absolutely modelled itself on the GID service at the Tavistock.
Right, the
Lots
one in
of
London.
cross-pollination, but since you people in England have, got sensible, we've sort
Oh,
of
not sure
pretended.
about that.
Well, I mean,
Sensible.
you're ahead of us, that's for sure. So in terms of, technically the clinic did close, and,
It did.
feels.
Well, I'm not sure if it actually has. I haven't checked. However, that my understanding is that they're actually opening like clinics around the country instead. So that was a kind of red herring.
Yeah,
But yes, I know
well,
what you mean. We are a bit
yeah,
ahead
I
of
mean,
Australia.
yeah, I think you are ahead, despite all of that, and despite the kind of constant pushback from, the parents' lobby who can't stand the thought that they've harmed their children. I still think you're in a better place than we are, because despite the fact that we've just had a really important family court case where a family court judge, a senior judge, has torn shreds off the head paediatrician that ran, established, built, and then got promoted at the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne. So she's been, torn apart by a senior judge, and the progressive Labor government here just is pretending it's not happening. They haven't commented on it at all. So anyway, this fellow breastfeeding counsellor, and I got into, like, it wasn't really a debate, but, kind of a shocked, stilting conversation about her 4-year-old daughter socially transitioning. And I'd just come from a family funeral where a teenage child, a boy, hadn't gone to the funeral of his grandfather because he'd just transitioned to a girl socially and medically, and he felt it was too much to go to this family funeral. It was on the other side of the family. And so I was talking about that, thinking that I was in this woman-centered, sensible, sex realist space. And instead what I got was this young counsellor, saying that my family had done the wrong thing in not allowing this 19-year-old to transition when he was a child, whereas she was doing the right thing in allowing her 4-year-old to socially transition, you know? So, yeah, as you can imagine, that was a pretty difficult conversation. And as a result of that conversation, this woman who just horrifically ended up living just down the road from where I still lives just down the road from where I am. This little girl who became a boy went to my youngest's primary school. I see her quite regularly, like it's the full nightmare. But she lodged a complaint against me within the Breastfeeding Association, and I was required to apologize through my through my group leader and branch representative, not directly to this girl, despite this young woman, despite her living in my community and me seeing her quite regularly. I wasn't allowed to speak to her directly because she was so distressed, allegedly. I mean, I'm sure she was distressed, but there was nothing that I said that was actually distressing. Like, I was talking about my family and the choice that we made, and she was talking about her daughter and the choice that she made. And obviously, those two positions were in conflict, but I didn't say, anything bad about her. But she did say that if you don't let them transition, then they'll kill themselves, which obviously I took offense at because she was saying, like, I did just say, well, there's no evidence that that's true.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been debunked, hasn't it?
Yeah. Anyway, I'm giving you a massive amount of detail. That's how it
That's
all
okay.
started. And then at the end of that year, the Australian Breastfeeding Association kicked off this gender neutral language consultation, which is like, like a lot of women will relate to that as the
Can I
way that.
just ask, did you apologise?
Um, yeah, I sort of did. I mean, because, I mean, I didn't really realize at the time because I was talking to my regional rep and, you know, we were colleagues, trained at the same time, had been counselors for a long time. And she was very empathetic and talked about her own experiences, being called a swerf because she opposed sex work and, swerfs and turfs and all of this sort of thing. And she gave me some background information about this young counsellor and what she'd been through. And so I felt sorry for her. Like, I disagreed with the notion that it's a breach of our code of ethics at a pre-conference drinks when you're talking to an equal to have a difference of opinion, which was what she was saying. She said that she felt vilified and victimized and blah, blah, blah. And I just said, well, no, the code of ethics is about governing our relationship with healthcare professionals and mothers that we're supporting. It's not about having only one opinion about such a contentious topic as pediatric medical transition. We're not even supposed to talk about, well, like the Australian Breastfeeding Association to this day doesn't have a policy on something that isn't about breastfeeding. Like
Yeah,
it's just not really like with
it's
Leslie,
outside the, yeah,
yeah,
it's
it's
outside
well
their
outside the scope,
remit.
mixing causes, all of that.
Like
That's how we.
I can kind of understand you wanting to apologise for it because she was upset and
Yeah.
like you didn't mean to cause her upset, but
Yeah.
if you are being asked, and I don't know if you were, if you're being asked to apologise for what you said, like for disagreeing with each other, then I
Yeah.
would struggle with that bit.
Yeah, yeah. Look, I mean, my background's in public relations, so I probably have kind of seen my way around many apologies in a
Yeah,
professional capacity, not so much in a personal or volunteer capacity. But I did feel that I could, without being really insincere, but, apologize for her distress and it's going to sound really cliched now, but it wasn't my intention to
no.
distress her,
course.
and I understand it was a distressing conversation, and I think I said something like, if I'd known that she'd been at the gender clinic that day, then I wouldn't have raised the topic of my own family member,
The
because
thing is, though,
obviously I would know that that would be
yeah,
distressing, you know?
but you going to a funeral is distressing as well, and you need space to be able to share your experience. So, mm,
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, the ABA never really, to this day, kind of came to terms with that. You know, this counsellor kind of followed me through the following years up, and yeah, maybe I should say what happened next and see if we get
okay,
to how she came up later in the kind
okay,
of, what's the word, the marathon of
okay,
saying, you know, dealing with all of this, you know, what happens when you make gender identity important in women's health or in breastfeeding. It just, honestly, it's kryptonite to
yeah,
breastfeeding and maternity and women's health. And it just destroys everything in its wake, you know?
of course,
It's like that, you know, I don't know if you're old enough to remember, but remember the Never Ending Story, that
yeah,
kids film, and
yeah,
the nothing? That's what gender identity is like in women's health and in breastfeeding support services. It just destroys everything.
of
Really not
course it does.
exaggerating.
Yeah,
Yeah, so we
so
got to the end of the year and we had this consultation, and it was a real kind of push-pull type consultation where they framed it that the World Health Organization encouraged everyone to use, you know, to make sex relevant when it's relevant and not when it's not, and to use gender neutral language. But when you looked at the guidelines that they were referring to, it was in the context of the World Health Organization being a global organization which has people from all around the world who actually speak different languages, and the way that gender as a grammatical construct is dealt with in those different languages, and how, as a neutral, kind of universally communicative World Health Organization diplomat or worker, how you should deal with that, you know? So it was really quite dishonest to say that, you know, let's be like the World Health Organization. That's my
confused.
husband.
How is being a woman or a man not universal? It's
Yeah,
confusing me.
yeah, yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah. So they had this consultation, and me and quite a lot of other counsellors said that it was a terrible idea to use gender neutral language, or as it became later known, you know, de-sex language, to erase mothers from breastfeeding. It was a terrible idea.
You had a consultation where they were
Yeah.
telling you that, well, they were pushing that they wanted you to use gender neutral language.
Yeah. And so that looked like talking about chest feeding, breastfeeding parents, birthing people, the full disaster. And, you know, the Australian Breastfeeding Association is at its heart really quite a sensible, mumsy type of organisation. And so they got quite strong pushback, not just from me, but from lots of counsellors, that we really weren't comfortable with, you know, erasing mothers from our counselling practice. And, you know, we understood the kind of desire to be welcoming or encouraging to the small proportion of the community that might not see themselves as mothers, but who nonetheless were women. And if they wanted to be called parents, then, you know, of course, in our counselling practice, one to one, you'd call them whatever they called themselves, you know.
Yeah,
And so even though really were trained to use that woman-centered, mother-centric, mother-supportive language, you know, no one had any problems with adapting our counseling style to the individual needs of the woman in front of us.
yeah,
Yeah, but it was really pushed by the kind of leadership team and the elected branch presidents in each state and territory, that made us exclusionary. It was really kind of demonized that if you didn't say breastfeeding families and breastfeeding parents, then you were kind of somehow mean and nasty.
It's
So,
ridiculous. It's only the mother who breastfeeds. You don't get the other children to breastfeed, and you certainly don't get the man to breastfeed, and you don't get your pets to breastfeed. It's the mother that breastfeeds. It's
yeah,
not the family.
yeah, it's not the
Although,
family.
of course, a woman needs the family support in order to be able to breastfeed because it just takes so much out of you, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That is just, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, it was and it continues to be like quite difficult to deal with just because, there was and there continues to be a lot of gaslighting from the Australian Breastfeeding Association, which used to be called Nursing Mothers. For the first 30 years of its existence, it was Nursing Mothers. And then they changed it to the Australian Breastfeeding Association. And the argument that was given at the time about why they did that was that when it was established in the late years, you couldn't put the word breastfeeding or the word breast in the yellow pages. So they called it the euphemism of nursing mothers because, that wasn't pornographic,
yeah,
talking about breasts or breastfeeding, was a bit much for the 50s. And so to have an organization with that history then dehumanize mothers and kind of disembody mothers from breastfeeding and then not even talk about breastfeeding, but talk about, you know, chest feeding or human milk feeding or body feeding or it was really quite it's difficult to find the right words, like viscerally cruel and
yeah,
offensive
yeah.
and
Well, that
just
was the response that I had when you were telling me. Absolutely. Like, it's not families that breastfeed, it's mothers.
yeah. And if the leadership had been honest and said, set up a more thorough process, a thorough national conversation with counsellors at state and territory levels, at regional levels, feed it in, try and find a solution to the problem about how do we deliver our core business, which is mothers and babies, but also recognize the importance of fathers to breastfeeding. Like we know that when the father is supportive, the rates of continuing breastfeeding just go through the roof. It's incredibly influential. I think second only to health professionals and what health professionals say to women during pregnancy. So, so how do we, serve our current and always will be majority community, include fathers to the extent that it helps mothers?
Yeah.
And then also, how do we have a specialized conversation with, a very small group that have very specific needs that might actually, in some circumstances, be beyond the scope of a volunteer breastfeeding counsellor. And
Hmm.
I think that's really where the ABA kind of strategically stumbled in thinking that there was this language about, ring fencing support for trans and gender diverse women, who identify as men with this specialized material. Like they did this little book
Yeah.
for them and some breastfeeding education classes specifically for them. But to think that they could do that without impacting upon everybody else when they should really have known from just a moment's examination of the nature of that community that they just cannot tolerate language that doesn't center their particular view of the world. Do you know what I mean? Like they're
Yeah.
really allergic to mother-centric language when they're also doing something that is intrinsically maternal,
Yeah.
breastfeeding.
Yeah, it's really
So,
important. In that
yeah,
circumstance, it's so important. The language is like it's it helps you describe everything. And if you can't
yeah.
describe what you're doing, then what have you got left?
Yeah. Well,
How do you
and also I
communicate?
think, yeah, I mean, for volunteer breastfeeding counselors, we were all trained to use that mother centering language. And we're actually in all of the founding documents, like the Constitution and all the training manuals and all of that sort of thing. We're actually, experts in mother to mother support. So why, it's a conversation that they didn't even have. Do you want to provide support to women who may or may not have had their breasts cut off, have a whole range of like very complex psychosocial issues, who
Yeah.
feel alienated by our very organization? Maybe that's really something we should have left to the paid professionals, to the lactation
Yeah.
consultants, and not burden volunteer breastfeeding counselors with it.
Yeah. So I've done a lot of work with volunteers in my career.
Yeah,
And one of the things that you can't do is tell volunteers what they have to do. Like, yes, like if you want to be a volunteer here, these are our policies and what have you. Yes, everybody
yeah,
needs to fit into a set of rules and sort of health and safety and things like that. But
yeah,
you can't tell them who, like, you can't tell them. You have to, if you want something to be achieved by them, you have to take them with you. You can't just impose things on them.
yeah.
It's very
That's
different from having employees.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that the ABA really forgot, that breastfeeding belongs to mothers, not
Yes.
to the ABA. I
Yeah.
think the ABA felt this sense of ownership that they, because at a senior leadership level, they wanted to reach out to this vulnerable community as they saw it, and they didn't really reflect on the fact that some of them had teenage and young adult children who were part of this community, and that might be a conflict of interest for them in meeting, our charitable objects, which were not about that. And, that's before you even get into the other massively fraught area of men being given volunteer support to,
Yeah.
try to induce lactation from their, you know, stimulated breasts, chest stimulated to breasts and then chemically stimulated further to excrete some kind of fluid that we don't know a lot about. And, more importantly than what's in it, it's what happens if you do that to the pre-existing relationship of the mother and child, which is what all the breastfeeding counsellors are ethically bound to support and preserve, So yeah, they, spectacularly poor management and lack of insight that they went off on this kind of wild adventure. And then when they got, quite, I was going to say slap back, but, we were much too nice to slap them back. When they got significant feedback that they were going on the wrong path, they did try to right their course, but they were very vindictive against those who pointed out that they were on the wrong path. And they launched these kind of like Kafkaesque complaint investigation disciplinary processes where, like I had oh my goodness, I forgot now. I think it was over 2 hours interview with 2 board members where I was asked to account for my conduct in responding to a consultation by saying that we shouldn't use dehumanizing terms like black birthing bodies, chest feeding, human milk feeding. And yeah, so
This is so familiar. Like, shoot the messenger for telling the
yes,
truth. Like, it's like a playbook, isn't it? You hear
Yeah,
the same thing over and over again.
yeah,
That is it's horrendous. Like they're asking you as part of a consultation, like how can you ask someone their views and then punish them for what they tell you?
yeah, yeah. And so I ended up getting sacked, as did 5 other of the 7 that we knew of who were investigated, disciplined, and sacked. So 5 of the 7 were sacked, and the other 2 were just told to be good and, absorbed back into the association. And probably those 2 were both health professionals as well as breastfeeding counsellors, and they took a slightly different approach in their response to the complaints, which involved sort of taking quite high powered legal support in with them. And yeah, that seemed to scare the ABA enough in relation to those 2 who were perhaps at the lower end of offending. So, you know, they couldn't
Also,
really.
they used more sanitized language to say what you were saying,
Yeah,
perhaps.
yeah,
Goodness.
pretty much. And I think also I mean, not that I need to be fair to the ABA, but those 2 perhaps gave their opinion through the consultation process less often than I did or the others did. So when the complaints came through, we quite quickly got in contact with each other because we could see, one of us would comment and then the comment would get deleted, or, there'd be like a narky admin message, or, um, yeah, they were sort of the things that happened. So we connected up. So when the complaints came in, we were all kind of comparing. It was like, well, I've got
Okay.
5. Well, how many have you got? Well, I've got 2.
So
And
was this who was it that complained?
yeah, so all of these conversations happen in the main in closed breastfeeding support groups. So there was a big, like about 3,000 women across Australia in a closed private group on Facebook. And the minority of the complaints came from there, but they were all from fellow breastfeeding counsellors. And then some of the other came from, we had this group called volunteer support, which was just volunteers, and that was where the consultation was mostly based. And yeah, absolutely, so the consultation was launched in November. It was communicated that we weren't changing language in December, and then late January the complaints started coming in. It was kind of like a dummy spit. It's like they didn't get what they wanted, so now they were going to punish
It
those who
sounds like
said that it was a bad idea.
activists. It sounds like active got into, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
So it sounds like there was some people in the organization who were on your side, as it were. They were mother-centric, and then you've
yeah,
got these activists pushing back against it and
yeah.
complaining.
Well, I did call them activists at the time, and some of the sort of middle of the road counsellors were quite angry with me and others for calling them activists. So, like, no, they're just, progressive counsellors, like as if I wasn't progressive. But the truth is, they were, how do I put this? They did collude together to orchestrate these mass complaints against us. One of the complaints that I think 5 of the 7 of us, it may have been 4 of the 7 of us got, was actually a group complaint that was sent to the board, and, which is completely outside the normal complaints process. And that's why I got interviewed by 2 board members, that and the national helpline manager and the branch manager were like off on sick leave because it was so stressful being in the middle of like a witch hunt, even though they weren't the witches being hunted. But anyway, and also in the complaints policy, there there's rules about who can investigate complaints based on who lodged the complaints. So, yeah, to this day, I'm fairly certain that the then branch president for New South Wales and the Australian Capital Territory, who's also the now branch president, organised those mass complaints that were sent to the board. It really sounded like, because I've got a communications background, like I
Yeah.
can read some words, and if I've listened to that person talk quite a
Hmm.
bit, and or I've read their comments on social media, like it stands out like dog's balls to me. I'm
Yeah.
like, that's her. So anyway, I'm pretty sure it was her. But I'm talking too much about the ABA because what happened in the middle of all of this? So I got sacked in July of 2021. In May of 2021, it hit the media, and Um, there were 3 breastfeeding counsellors who spoke to Bernard Lane, who you might know about
Yeah,
because he's
yeah, I've
a bit
heard
of
of
a
him.
legend, who was then working for the Australian. And but we all spoke to the Australian anonymously. And I'm the only one who's outed myself as
Yeah.
being one of the 3 that spoke to the
Okay.
Australian. But a few months ago, I filled in some gaps that one of the other women was Carleen Gribble, who subsequently wrote an article with other maternity academics about D-sex language. By then, they were calling it D-sex language. And so it was interesting because that article really, it was an important article, but it really didn't talk about, the elephant in the room, which was the Australian Breastfeeding Association. And so, you know, I guess although I'm grateful that, the other academics and Carleen, produced that bit of work, I think it would have been um, better for everyone and all the other counsellors if she'd been able to be upfront about her role in not just that article, but a number of other articles where she gave off the record comment. And so did others, and others were found out and sacked. And she didn't tell them that she was part of it. And I mean, I didn't want anyone to be sacked, but I feel like if we had shown better sisterly solidarity, then it would have been harder for the Australian Breastfeeding Association to pick us off against each other.
Yeah.
And so, when I saw Ruth come out and, now set up, we call it MoMA, their new
Mama,
organisation.
yeah.
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 It was very bittersweet because, I just wish we could have been as strategic as a group in Australia. And I think if we had, we would be in a better place now.
Yeah.
So,
That's the thing, though. That's the thing about women. It's we don't automatically get on to and form partnerships, and sometimes it's quite difficult to accept. I know, like when I see what could be done if we just came together, it's so frustrating, but it doesn't always work like that. Because, like, for me, I would work with anybody to achieve a goal. Like, I really would. But even if they're annoyed us or whatever, I'd put that to one side and try and work through it. But not all women are like that.
I
There's
know,
competition, isn't there? Maybe it's that.
yeah, I do really struggle with this. Yeah. I mean, I think you're so right. But I continue to struggle with it because I just think how much better would we be if we didn't, have petty kind of, I don't even like
Grudges,
to say the word, but fights,
fights,
about
yeah.
things that don't matter when what's being done to women is just devastating
Yeah.
and we really need to pull together.
It's
I
such a
mean,
shame
which
that
is
that hasn't
why,
happened.
I've established this organisation now in Victoria called Women's Voices Australia to help to try and, amplify women's voices against some new, particularly horrendous legislation that they're trying to introduce in my home state called the Social Cohesion and Anti-Vilification Act. And
So
it's just like,
it
it's
sounds
just
like
going
it's the opposite of that.
to, yeah. So it's just going to give a massive stick to angry, cross-sex ideating men against women like me who say, outrageous things like men can't breastfeed, and that I don't believe that trans women are women. I mean,
Well, that's a
patently
terrible
they're
thing to
not.
think.
Shocking. Shocking.
Shocking.
Yeah. Yeah.
Humans can't change sex. How controversial.
Yeah. And I think this is a thing as well, why I struggle with, lack of sisterly solidarity is, obviously the Australian Breastfeeding Association was, treacherous in the extreme. Like when I ended up speaking to the board about why I shouldn't be expelled as a member. So, it's sort of 6 months apart, I was sacked as a breastfeeding counsellor, and then because I continued to talk about what they did to me and others, I was then, expelled as a member of the association. And when I spoke to the board about why I shouldn't be expelled, um, like I just said to them, it's like, I'm exactly what you trained me to be.
Yeah.
You trained me to advocate for mothers and babies, and that's what I've done. And how can it be that that's now something that I should be expelled for?
It's unbelievable, isn't it? Like, it's just over and over. Every time I have conversations like this, I think that can't be true, but I know that it is. It's it's just shocking. So where are
yeah.
we now? So you've got stuff going on right now, haven't you? That there's stuff in the courts.
Yeah. So when that media article came out, the Bernard Lane article, like I would say minimum 1,000 women were on the Australian Breastfeeding Association's Facebook page in the days following that page 3, big story, saying, what are you doing? Like really pleading with the ABA in a way that was very upsetting to see as a breastfeeding counsellor.
Yeah.
Just saying, like, please use our language and, don't turn motherhood and breastfeeding into this, degraded kind of trans activist dehumanizing sort of language. And, the ABA just gaslit and denied, just said, media reports that there is pressure to use the word chest feeding instead of breastfeeding are largely untrue. Claims that counsellors have been sacked are incorrect. Like I hadn't been sacked yet at that stage, but 2 others had already been sacked. So they just lied and continued to gaslight the Australian public and their counsellor population about what was happening. And so as they continued to sack others of us, media continued to write about it. And finally, it became sort of undeniable, really, that they had sacked a whole load of us. So then they tried to say that they didn't sack us because of use of the word mother or, us being told not to use the word mother, even though the complaint said that we had a near obsessive use of the word mother. Like that was what the board complaint said. So I mean, it did send you crazy because they just kept saying something that wasn't true, and like, fortunately, because I have a background in, public relations and working with journalists, the way that I helped journalists to understand that I was telling the truth was I just used to give them the letters that the ABA had sent to me, like, the complaint letters, the investigation letters and the sacking letters. And then the journalists would just go, whoa, like, and they'd talk to the ABA and the ABA like, oh no, didn't mean that. She was like, okay. Anyway, so in the middle of all of that, there was this man who I didn't know was kind of watching, who thought it was a good idea to hop on this Facebook page and share his own experience as a trans woman breastfeeding his newborn. And, it was very distressing. And a lot of women responded to him directly, said that, like he was talking about colostrum and like, obviously only the birth mother makes colostrum, and whatever he chemically induced with domperidone, it's not the same as colostrum. And, you know, although we've got very little evidence about this whole field of men breastfeeding, it is clear that they make starvation quantities of whatever it is that they're making. It's not enough to sustain a child, and he knows that because he stopped. He says, one, it was always supplemental to his wife, and two, he stopped at 2 or 3 days after his son was born because it wasn't enough. So, why are we still talking about this 5 years later? I do not know. But so I saw him there. He was interacting with some of my friends. My friends were being threatened in messages from admin, social media officer, fellow counsellors. And so I just said to the ABA, at ABA, there's a man who, like pretending to be a woman, and said this man's name. And, counsellors deserve a safe workplace. When you've dealt with it, can you let us know so we can return to work? Yours in mothering or something like that. Now, I realise it was a bit inflammatory, but
Well, no, I wouldn't say it was. Like, sorry, like, I know
no.
what you mean. I know what you mean, but safeguarding babies is inflammatory. Like, it's inflammatory not to do that. That should
Yeah.
be in a sane world.
In a sane world, it wouldn't be inflammatory. I mean, particularly because at that stage, like I'm a bit of a true believer. Obviously, I'd been a member of the ABA for a long time, and I genuinely didn't believe that they really wanted breastfeeding counsellors to abandon mothers and babies and instead work with men, which is why I put it to them in a public place that that's what was happening. And so anyway, I got blocked for that. And then a few hours later, like less than 2 hours later, I got an email from the national breastfeeding manager, which is like she's a midwife, and it's like a senior kind of problem solving role, and the chief executive saying that, you appear to have breached the code of conduct twice this morning, like,
By raising
and
safeguarding
screenshot.
problems. By
Yeah.
raising safeguarding issues.
Yeah.
Like,
And attached a little screenshot of me saying what I just described to you before, and then another screenshot of me responding to another mother who said that she was getting angry at the ABA for everything they were doing and what was reported in the media. And I was sort of trying to calm her down. And I was like, everybody knows, including angry mobs. And I meant all the trans activists who were carpet bombing the page, that only mothers breastfeed. And so that got breached as well. And then this man has just like fixated on me ever since. So, we now see through the tribunal documents that he stayed in contact with that woman, Naomi Hull, the whatever she was, breastfeeding information manager, for a year, you know, and she responded to him, and he was like, "Have you sacked Jasmine yet?" And she'd be like, "Well, we have let her go." Like, they just utterly breached every, like, privacy obligation they had to me. Like, and the most serious one is that one of the complainants, one of the social media officers who'd lodged a complaint against me, she was the one who was threatening multiple women on the page that day, including my friends, for trying to educate this man that, men don't make colostrum and that it's important that the baby stays chest to chest with the mother when she's just given birth. that counsellor was the one who screenshot my comment and deleted it within like 10, 15 minutes of me posting it. And she lodged a complaint with this Naomi Hull woman, the breastfeeding information manager, and the chief executive, which they then lodged with me like 2 hours later. And then in the tribunal document, this man admits that this same counsellor wrote to him at like 11 o'clock that night, and you can see the timestamp on all the documents, told him that I was a breastfeeding counsellor, told him that I'd made this comment earlier that day, gave him a copy of the comment, told him that she'd made a complaint about me and that I was an active current breastfeeding counsellor and that my transphobia was unacceptable, and then gave him a copy of the complaint like form link and said to him, you should make a complaint. I already have, but it will hold more weight coming from the affected party. So, like, sorry to bang on about it, but what I read from all of that is that if she hadn't have told him, he never would have known. He only knew because she told him that I was a breastfeeding counsellor, because
So
there were
that's a breach
literally
of
thousands of
confidentiality,
comments.
isn't it? It's a
Sorry?
breach of confidentiality, and they've
Yeah,
encouraged someone to complain about you.
yeah, yeah. And so, yeah, so the ABA knew about all of that. Anyway, so like fast forward to the following year, and he's still chatting with his support person, at the ABA, and then the expulsion. I'm still blocked despite being a member of the ABA from all their Facebook groups. And then I get expelled as a member. He continues to write to them as I do media. He was like sending them copies of like TV interviews I did, like media articles about it, saying, is she sacked, like not knowing obviously that they had this other way that they could punish me to expel me as well. But he was like, and then the following year in 2023, I in Queensland posted so he did an article with the Daily Mail that year around the same time that in 2022, around the same time that I got expelled, promoting his amazing breastfeeding experience, with his newborn, and downplaying the fact that it only lasted a couple of days and he made starvation quantities, and, big up saying that, his wife was unwell, and if it wasn't for him, then his baby could have been much sicker, and it was lucky that he'd made, this milk. Yeah, so a year later, I responded to a woman in Queensland who was promoting Kelly J's visit to
Yeah.
Australia in 2023, and she'd posted this Daily Mail article, a couple of segments of it, and given her opinion about it. And she didn't even know me or that I'd had interactions with this man, back in 2021. And so I responded to her post and gave some more information about his failed breastfeeding experience. And he then reported that we've got this thing called the E-Safety Commissioner, who went straight to Twitter and said that my post and this other woman in Queensland's post was adult cyber abuse. And I'm not laughing because it's funny, it's just so Orwellian and ridiculous, And so Twitter then wrote to me like day apart, twice, first saying, we've received a complaint that says that you've broken Australian laws from a government entity. And then the next time saying, we've geo-blocked your post because, it breaks Australian laws. And so obviously at that stage, I was just beside myself because, like, I've been sacked, I've been expelled, and now I'm not even allowed to advocate for mothers and babies without being told 'Cause at that stage, I didn't know that it was the E-Safety Commissioner. I suspected it was, but, it could have just as easily been one of the human rights commissions or the police. Like, it was scary.
Yeah.
Yeah, anyway, so I pushed back against that and did some media work to just say that, this is an important conversation and we have legitimate concerns about the sabotage of mothers and babies and the just disgraceful claim that men have a human right to affirm their gender identity by inducing lactation. Like, it's just completely unacceptable for a large number of reasons. And so then he took great offense to me exercising my freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and to be fair, like, my expertise and experience in working with mothers and babies. So he took great offense and he lodged a complaint with the Queensland Human Rights Commission, which is up the north and I'm down the south of the country. And they took like 6 months to have a look at it. And then in their wisdom, they sent me the complaint in November 2023 and it's still going.
So they took 6 months to look at it, and were you aware that it had been made at that point?
No,
So you
no.
didn't know about it
Yeah.
until after 6 months.
Yeah.
Why did it take them
And
6 months?
I think that just because, they're busy. I don't know.
They're busy
Maybe they were
policing
still
social media
yeah,
for
yeah,
wrong thing.
yeah, for wrong think. Yeah,
So not only have you been expelled from doing something that you are doing voluntarily because you love doing it,
yeah,
you're then like punished, and then you're being shut down from talking about it as well.
yeah.
That's just like abuse after abuse after abuse. That's horrendous. I'm not surprised that you're very upset. It's
Yeah,
understandable.
and I mean, like, I've had some amazing women and some, like, lovely lawyers who've helped me along the way, and you know, I'm grateful to them. But yeah, it is a bit of a burden to carry.
Yeah,
And like,
yeah,
mostly I just kind of try and skate over the top of it because it can get a bit overwhelming if you think about it too much. Yeah. So we had conciliation with the Queensland Human Rights Commission. And that failed despite our best efforts to try to resolve it. And then, so he has the choice to take it further to the Queensland Civil Administrative Tribunal, which I think you have the same things in the UK, these administrative like tribunals. And so we had a compulsory conference with them early this year. And then we had a directions hearing a few months ago. And I've got amazing lawyers who I feel
excellent.
like very supported by, and the Human Rights Law Alliance, and they're just like all over it, like a highly effective rash,
Yeah,
spreading, kind of doing their magic. That's not a very good analogy. They're just very thorough, and I
yeah,
I feel they really understand what this is about,
yeah,
and that this is really important. That that this isn't just about did I say something which came close to or not vilification, which has a very specific definition, but do we have the right to defend mothers and babies and to talk about unethical medical experiments on babies and to uphold the human rights of babies under all the state, national and international human rights laws and child protection laws. It's actually really serious. And, I'm not saying that, this isn't about this individual. This is about the principle of boundaries and, the purpose of breastfeeding and early infant care. And as the Australian Breastfeeding Association, always taught us, breastfeeding is for the baby, not the baby for breastfeeding. And like what that means is we're not like dogmatic or, overly passionate in insisting that, every mother breastfeed. It's like breastfeeding is for the baby. It's not a status symbol for, you know, the mother, or it's certainly not a validation tool for, a father who insists on being also recognized as the mother. Like, clearly that's not in the best interests of the child.
No, not at all.
Why is this controversial for me to say this,
Well, it isn't, but it's been made to be, hasn't it? It's ridiculous. And I can't imagine how much stress you're under. I've had a little bit of a thing happen to me as well, not on the same scale as this. And it doesn't actually affect me, like in practical terms, very much. But the stress has been quite difficult to deal with. And I'm having to like make sure I'm putting my self-care in, make sure I look after myself. So I
Yeah,
hope that you are able to do the same and look after yourself.
I try. It's
Yeah,
funny, now that I've got these lovely lawyers and, the King's Counsel, Tony Morris, I do feel, I don't want to kind of signal too much to the other side who does like to obsessively watch everything I say, but I do feel quite secure
yeah.
in that.
It makes you feel supported having that.
Yeah, it really does. And, it is also it is still stressful because, it's quite a complex set of things that have happened over a long time period. And so when I meet new people or, even when I see family that I don't see very often or, my children's friends or, my husband's work colleagues, like it's a lot to be, continually kind of, I don't want to say judged, but, maybe assessed or to feel like you
Yeah.
have to justify,
Yeah.
like what's happened.
You're not sure which side people are on and what they're thinking about you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I get that. Yeah. Um, as well, you had a lot of support from a lot of women. I
Yeah. I
didn't want
really
to
have.
interrupt you when you were in your flow, but on that Facebook page, all of the women were supporting you because everyone
Yeah.
knows what's right.
Yeah, yeah, they do. And I've had some amazing support as well over the years, even just on Twitter from, women in England and in America and in Canada. And, I do feel that sisterly sense of,
Yeah.
the
Is
solidarity.
it is a
And
lovely feeling
yeah, and
having
I
that
know like
support.
Kate Scottow, is that how you say it? Busted wench.
Who's that, sorry?
Kate Scottow. I think her Twitter name is Busted Wench.
I don't think I know her.
She had one of the quite early disastrous experiences with a man who claims to be a woman who I think did have past convictions around crimes.
Okay,
And yeah, I've chatted with her a bit. And yeah, sometimes it's great to just talk to people who
who
are
get
quite
it?
far apart from it and they just go, Jasmine, like, you do know they're pedophiles, don't you? Kind of thing, not talking about this man in particular, but just like, obviously
Hmm.
there's some really dark stuff going on
Yeah,
in the whole world of, cross-sex ideation. And
yeah,
yeah, sometimes it's good to just kind of realize that this isn't about me but that it is important to hold a line, really important to hold a line.
definitely.
So yeah.
And you were talking at the beginning about the woman that you had a disagreement with, and you said you were going to come back to that. I
Yeah.
don't think you
Yeah.
did. Would you like to
Yeah.
say what's happened with that since?
Yeah. Well, so when I got expelled, she went on a bit of a rampage across social media, like set up a couple of accounts where she said some fairly crazy things about me, like that I was crazy, that I was seriously mentally ill, and so we ended up having to write to her and ask her to stop, and she did in some ways stop. She deleted some of the worst things that she said, and she locked down her accounts, but she also wrote to my son. Fortunately, now he's in secondary school, but wrote to my son's principal, which was where her son also attended school, and tried to get me, I'm not exactly sure what her objective was, but
Okay.
and she boasted about that online, that, that when I went on TV, and, like, I didn't identify her in the slightest. I just said, like, what I just said to you, a young breastfeeding counsellor with a 4-year-old, and, she tried to kind of make a claim that I'd identified her and vilified her child, and yeah, so there was that, and then yeah, she stayed in the Breastfeeding Association and continued to talk about me in that closed volunteer group, which friends still in the Breastfeeding Association, continued to report to me. And I had to, like, again and again write to the ABA and go, screenshot, here she is again, like, can you delete this as per your terms and conditions, So, yeah, I guess I just really relate to, that idea that whenever things get bad in this world, it's almost always going to be coming from a mother or a father, a parent who's transitioned their child, and they
Mm,
just cannot abide anyone having a different view or experience about the harms of, pediatric transition, whatever type of transition. And so they're just very vicious in lodging complaints and pursuing you, until they can pursue you no more.
yeah. I think that's what's happened in the case that is happening to me as well. Yeah, then it's still ongoing, and I'm not sure where it's going to go. So I'm not going to say too much about that. But I totally get it. It's the same playbook over and over again, and I've seen it with lots of other women as well. It's the
Yeah.
same thing over and over again
Yeah.
because they
I
can't
mean,
admit that
I
they were
think
wrong.
you've just got to push back, sorry, like, early and often,
Yeah,
and like lawyers' letters, counter complaints, like whatever you
yeah,
can do to just reduce the payoff that they get from
yeah.
pursuing.
Is that what you would recommend to make complaints about them as well? Because I'm in two
Well,
minds about whether that's going to make it worse or not.
yeah. Well, I mean, like, I hate making complaints. I just
Yeah,
can't tell you how much I hate it. I'm very loath to do it. But I do think that they've had a lot of success from their obsessive complaint making and kind
yeah,
of lawfare,
yeah,
that, all these authorities, government bodies, they just kind of can't withstand the constant complaints, so they comply. And so I do think we've got to
got to do it.
push back. I
Yeah.
mean, I hear what you're saying, that maybe sometimes it makes it worse, and
Hmm.
maybe, you know, you've got to be judicious in the way that you do it. But sometimes I think it's good as well to get in first, you
Yeah,
know, with a complaint. Like, if you're in a vulnerable place and you can see it coming a mile off, maybe it's better to, raise it with your superiors that, you know, how can we find a way to deal with the different perspectives that,
yeah,
you know, something like that.
yeah.
I don't know. I'm loath to give advice, really, but I think you've got to stand up for yourself.
You
Like,
do.
with this man, you know, if If e-safety had just said, no, it's not a thing, then I doubt he would have lodged, with the Queensland Human Rights Commission. And if the
Yeah.
Queensland Human Rights Commission, as was open to them, had said, she's making statements on the basis of your sex, not your gender identity, and your sex is not a protected characteristic for breastfeeding. So it's difficult for us to pursue this complaint, which is all factual, then we wouldn't be with the tribunal. So,
Yeah, so what kind of tribunal is it? I'm
yeah,
trying to
well,
think about what's the overarching structure of this action.
yeah. Well, it's a civil administrative tribunal. So
Okay.
it's, because the Anti Discrimination Act is civil in most parts, it does have some criminal bits, but, there's obviously a much higher threshold for any kind of criminal vilification, which obviously would be about violence, actual violence, not,
Not words.
hurty feelings violence. Yeah, so it's going to be a 5-day hearing in, not before March next year. And we're going to have to go through the, um, series of online posts that I made back in May 2023, which is when the e-safety commission complaint process happened, and when he, got sad because I responded and said, no, I'm allowed to say these things. And yeah, so we'll have to talk about them. And then we're going to have to talk about, is male lactation a thing? Like, what does the evidence tell us about the efficacy of male lactation? And what do we know about the primacy of the mother baby bond for healthy infant development and also for the mental health of the mother and the well-being of the mother, short, medium, and long term. So, yeah, it's going to be fairly epic from everything I can see.
And it's this human rights or what is it that's taking the
Yeah,
case? It's not him.
yeah. So it's the human rights law, but because the Human Rights Agency isn't a court, it's heard in the first instance at this Queensland Civil Administrative Tribunal.
Okay.
So, yeah. And I mean, unfortunately, that might not be the end of it. Like, if we win, if he can convince his lawyers who are acting pro bono for him to take it further, then, we could go to an appeal. And if he wins, I'm pretty sure my lawyers will want to
Yeah,
appeal it.
definitely.
Because, yeah, obviously, we just can't let it stand that we're not allowed to speak about the well-being of mothers and babies and the, highly biological nature of maternity and breastfeeding. Like, mothers aren't replaceable with fathers.
Not.
We're just not.
Yeah. Do you know a few months ago I said online, it was on LinkedIn, and there was a post about some dads taking the baby to a toilet or toddler to a toilet, and there was a big long thread about stuff, and anyway, I made a comment that women mother best. No, women make the best mothers, and I got told that I was sexist against both men and women at the same time. How clever am I? Just for
Go,
I think I
sister.
stated biological fact, and that's what I got back. That's
Wow.
just, and I don't know who made that post. I didn't know them or anything. I didn't know their circumstances, and I was actually in favour of what he said. Yes, dads need to be able to take their children to the toilet as well. You're not in disagreement with that, but some of the comments, I just think we need to think about what kind of society we want to raise children in and how we want to do that as in terms of how we go to work and when we've got children as mothers and as fathers perhaps as well. Because what
Yeah.
seems to be happening is they're blurring the boundaries between what a woman should do and what a man should do and saying they're interchangeable when they're not. And I think probably a lot more women would choose to stay at home with their babies and small children than go to work if it was a viable option. But we're not, we've taken that choice away.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I just think, that kind of tender years doctrine, which I think used to be a consideration in family court, you know, what's the word? Custody kind of
Yeah, yeah,
decisions,
yeah,
and stopped being quite a while ago, like maybe in the 80s or 70s, or, like in Australia at least. But it's just, I mean, we just know it to be true,
Mhm.
I've got 3 children and, we've all been children. And
Yeah.
when you're little, you love your mum and your dad, absolutely. But who do you call out for in the night?
It's
Of
always your
course, it's your
mum.
mum. And when babies are born, they don't know for a good year or so that they're separate being to their mothers.
Yeah.
That kind of individuation, that development, that takes time, and, like, obviously, I breastfed my 3 children for quite a while, and, my husband kind of joked that, once I stopped breastfeeding, then he kind of got a look in,
Yeah.
like, and I mean, good men aren't jealous of that relationship that their children have with their mother, because they love their mother and they know their children feel safe in their mother's arms in a way that is special and unique. And, it's just so sad that some of these men are kind of motivated by some kind of, I don't know, some strange competitive jealousy, like they can be a better mother than the mother, or something just kind of quite disturbing about, what kind of father would want their child to perceive them as a mother.
It's
Something
very
very,
worrying.
very disturbing about
Definitely.
the thought process and just the selfishness.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really do think we need to go back to basics when it comes to parenting and mothering and all, like, what are we doing? It doesn't
Yeah.
make any sense. And of course, I think we all know what's really needed. Yet the policies and the almost brainwashing about what should women should expect. It runs quite deep. I had a lot of women on that thread challenging me and saying, well, I need to work to earn my own money because otherwise I might be abused. And I'm like, well, like, obviously you don't want women to be abused and be stuck in abusive relationships, but that's turning the whole of society on its head for things that aren't ideal anyway. Do you know what I mean? We
Yeah.
need to have an ideal. Like, this is the ideal where, like, if the mother wants to and is happy to, is with the baby as much as possible, because that's what's
Yeah.
good for both of them
Yeah.
until a certain point, whatever that point is that, everyone agrees on, or maybe individuals have different ideas about that and do it differently. Do you know what I mean? It would just need to get back to basics
Yeah.
instead of
Yeah, we
shaping
do.
society around like extremes, because most relationships aren't abusive.
Yeah. Yeah.
I hope.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think there's a lot of kind of, pussyfooting around about, hurting dad's feelings, or, kind of mischaracterizing, women like you who say, well, mothers aren't replaceable and mothers are important, particularly in the early years, and that being described as sexist, like,
And
even,
extreme.
yeah, it's just ridiculous. Obviously, it's
Uh-huh.
not sexist. It's sex realist.
Mm-hmm.
It's just the truth that
Mm-hmm.
mothers have a different relationship with their babies and infants to fathers, in almost all circles, I mean, even, like the mother kangaroo care and, attachment theory. Unfortunately, if you kind of look into that and do like a dummy's guide to kangaroo care or attachment theory, they're these kind of Americanized YouTube videos, and they talk about parenting kangaroo care, or, parents and attachment theory. And it's like, mate, like Bowlby studied mothers and their children being separated in hospital. You can't falsify that into
Yeah,
being about parents and
yeah,
attachment.
yeah,
That's not what the science is about. And like
yeah.
kangaroo care, it's mother kangaroo care,
I was going to say, I don't know that much about kangaroos, but if I had to guess, I would think that the mother had a pouch and the dad doesn't. I
Yeah,
mean, I've
you
never
got it.
studied a kangaroo before, but that's me instinct. That's me
Yeah,
sort of educated guess or
yeah.
uneducated guess that male kangaroos don't have a pouch. Am I
Yeah.
wrong?
Well, it's for like it came out of resource poor countries where they didn't have humidity cribs. But, it was discovered that if you put the baby, as mostly they did anyway, in contact with the mother's breasts, even quite premature babies, can suckle at the breast. And obviously they're warmed, in the mother's cleavage and, breast
Yeah,
area, and that it significantly increases their survival. And even in resource rich countries like Australia and the UK, providing that kangaroo mother care to premature babies is literally life saving.
Mhm.
So to start pretending that it's something that it's not, it's actually kind of academic, not
And
misconduct,
of
but
of
it's,
course, if the mother isn't around for some of whatever reason, of course the father should step in, but
yeah,
the woman shouldn't be replaced if
no,
she's there and
yeah,
able to do it. My
yeah,
goodness.
yeah. Exactly. I mean, I've got a friend who said almost exactly to me what some of those people said to you on LinkedIn. And she had quite a premature baby, and she did spend a lot of time expressing for that baby, who's now, a teenager, very well. But her husband also held, the little girl on his chest, and she was sort of taking offense that I was reinforcing that kangaroo mother care is something that mothers do. And she's like, "Oh, but, and he's just as important as I am." And what I was trying to say to her, it's like, some women want to kind of be kind or be equitable or be, like support their husband, but it's like, actually, you can do that, but don't consent for the rest of us,
Yeah.
because we know that we do have a different role to men, and that, breastfeeding and early infant care, particularly for premature infants, is something that mothers are best placed to do. Scientifically, inarguably, mothers are best placed to do that.
Yeah, definitely. So, Jasmine, thank you so much for coming on and talking to me. Have you got anything to promote or any way that we can help you? What would you like to ask for, if anything?
That's all right. You can if you want to put the Human Rights Law Alliance thing in the
Have you got a
notes at the bottom.
crowdfunder?
Yeah,
Yeah, you,
y-
you sent me
you'd
that,
be
didn't you?
welcome to do
Yeah,
that. But it
I'll
was
put
lovely
that
to
in.
chat.
But thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story and your experience. It's horrible what's happening. It's almost unbelievable. And I think, I'm involved in this and I'm thinking about it and talking to lots of people who also know about it. But I'm also reaching people who I know from different parts of my life who are going, what? Who really don't get how bad it is and they don't
Yeah.
understand the consequences.
Well, bless you for doing that. Thank you for spreading the word.
It's important to get the word out there, but thank you so much.
Thanks. See ya.